Hey, fifth graders. So this is going to be lesson 2 of Unit 7. This is called The Plains Wars, and it deals primarily with like the subjugation of the Native Americans as they're kind of being rounded up by the United States military, um, primarily just due to the fact that they would not integrate into American society, which is understandable considering that they were here first. Uh, but as the United States pushed farther and farther west and was trying to control more and more of this land, the United States couldn't have the land that all of their people wanted and the farms and all that stuff, and also have the Native Americans have their previous way of life. And so unfortunately, because of that, there's this conflict, and the Native Americans, as have talked about many times, Native Americans lost. Um, the first thing we need to do is give you the answers to the previous lesson. I almost forgot. That would have been sad. Okay. So this is for Unit 7, Lesson 1. So number 1, some of the challenges faced by, it should be D as in dog, cowboys on the cattle drives, included bad weather, attacks from Native Americans, angry farmers, and deep rivers. Number 2, identify the major challenge during the building of the Central Pacific Railroad. That would be B, tunneling through the mountains. So if you recall, the Central Pacific started off on the west coast in California, and like one of the first things they had to do was go through the Sierra Nevada mountains and or that mountain range there, the Sierra Mountain Range, and so that was it was Sierra Nevada. Okay, I just said it dumb. Anyway, number 3, the Homestead Act of 1862 made it easier for people to settle in the Great Plains, which is going to lead directly into what we're going to be talking about here. Number 4, why were cattle drives important to the economy of the Plains region? So this was probably a really hard question for you guys because I looked and looked and I was like, it's implied, but there's no point where it actually gives it, like, it's not written in there, hey, cattle drives were important because of this reason or anything like that. So this might have been a little tricky for you, but really what it comes down to is that farming was difficult, right? Like the land was really hard to farm for a while. And so because of that, cattle drives were important. I think also, yeah, well, that's probably the main reason is the cattle drives, that the farming was so difficult. You could probably have also made some inferences to say that because a lot of people were growing or raising cattle as a means, you could have. That's not really inferring it. That's just obvious. But yeah, that. So I guess because a lot of people were raising cattle, and then also because farming was difficult, so that's why they were raising the cattle. Number 5, explain why many African Americans moved to Kansas after 1877. So this is basically when Reconstruction ended, and the South was essentially told, like, okay, do whatever you want, we don't care. And so there was no more federal troops there protecting them. Um, a lot of African Americans found that their lives were not greatly improved from when they were slaves, and so consequently, uh, that's why a lot of them moved out. So the answer that I came up with was when Reconstruction ended, so did federal protection for African Americans in the South. Many African Americans did not feel free in the South, which I think is a quote directly out of the book there. But yeah, it's just that once Reconstruction was over, and the army left, there was nobody there protecting the blacks from the people who had previously just straight up owned them. So on the back page, we've got our vocabulary. A long journey to guide animals from one place to another was called a cattle drive. Number 2, poverty means having no money and being poor. Number 3, people who journeyed to Kansas looking for freedom called themselves exodusters. Um, Number 4, a transcontinental railroad is a system of transportation that goes from one side of the country to the other. I would argue that that is not what a transcontinental railroad does. It goes from one side of a continent to another. It's not just going across a country, but a continent. But regardless, number 4 is transcontinental railroad. And number 5, a homesteader was a person who claimed land in the Great Plains. So those are your 5 answers. So, all right, jumping into the Plains Wars with the Native Americans. So, Section A is called Native American Lands, and it starts a brown ocean of buffalo once covered Native American lands. When the settlers and railroads came, the buffalo disappeared. The Native American way of life was threatened. All right, so right off the bat, let me just start by saying that every time it says buffalo, it's wrong. It's not a buffalo. There are buffalo. It's a real thing. Water buffalo is the kind of the most obvious one, but basically they look like cows with kind of like flatter horns. They are not what we call buffalo. Those are the American bison. And the book, throughout the entire book, calls them buffalo. They've been traditionally called buffalo for a really long time, but the fact of the matter is that a buffalo is a very different animal than the American bison, which is what we're talking about. So this right here, not a buffalo. It is a bison. All right, that out of the way. So the Homestead Act, which you have read about, gave settlers on the Great Plains property rights to the land. Property rights is going to be one of your vocabulary words. Property rights are the rights to own or use something for sale. Some Native American groups did not believe that land could belong to a person or that it could be sold. These different views of land and property led to major conflicts. I would argue that property rights are one of the biggest issue that came up, especially when you talk about the Plains Indians. Just the nature of the way that they lived, they tended to roam around. They had kind of a nomadic life where they would follow the herds of bison and other things like that. They did not make cities and stay there, and so consequently they didn't have this idea of property rights. And when you have someone who has they don't really understand what property rights are, and then you try to tell them that they can't come onto land that they've previously been allowed to come on, you're gonna have issues, right? So when the settlers would come out and they would say, "Hey, we own this land," they put a fence around it, and the Native Americans are like, "What are you talking about? You can't own this land. We've been traveling across this land for generations, for as long as anyone can remember." And then someone says, no, I have a piece of paper that says that I own this land, so you can't go on it anymore. Well, that's going to cause issues, and it causes lots of issues over the course of most of American history up until the Native Americans are kind of basically conquered, I guess, for lack of a better way of putting it. All right, losing a way of life. Native American groups such as the Lakota and the Cheyenne had been hunting buffalo, bison, on the Great Plains for centuries. These large animals were the most important part of Native American life on the Great Plains. They provided food, shelter, tools, and clothing. Before settlers and railroads arrived, around 50 million buffalo roamed the Great Plains. Over a period of about 40 years, settlers and railroad workers killed most of the huge animals. By 1900, fewer than 1,000 buffalo were left. In the 1860s, settlers and Native Americans fought over land. The United States government moved Native Americans to reservations to make more land available for settlers and railroads. A reservation, so this is also a vocabulary word, a reservation is land set aside for a Native American group or groups. Native Americans felt they had to fight for their way of life or it would be lost forever. The clashes between Native Americans and settlers during this period of westward expansion are called the Plains Wars. So kind of an interesting thing here. I think a lot of times when we talk about the buffalo being killed, the bison being conceived, and it's hard to remember. Anyway, we talk about the American bison being nearly wiped out. There are now, I don't think there's even 1 million of them, but we've built the populations back up. There's herds of bison, particularly in like South Dakota and stuff, where there's thousands upon thousands of these. And so we've been able to build them back up, but since there's now cities and towns and farms and things like that, you'll never have 30, what did it say, 50 million buffalo, 50 million bison roaming the Great Plains, because they would be constantly hit by cars, and it just is not possible anymore for it to be that way. However, there are stretches of nature preserves and things like that that have huge herds of buffalo that are protected. Um, but yeah, so the killing off of them, a lot of, we talk about like, oh yeah, they were shooting them for sport and things like that. Well, yes, but also not exactly. See, um, the government and the army and just the people in general from the United States, the settlers, weren't stupid. They knew that the bison was important to the Lakota and the Cheyenne and just the general Plains Indians, Native Americans, way of life. And so they were actively trying to wipe this animal out, because that was a way to uh, basically destroy the Native American culture and force them either onto reservations or to integrate into American society. So it was not just like, a bunch of drunk hillbillies, sitting and just shooting things just for fun. I mean, it was probably also a little bit that, but it was also the U.S. government telling people, like, kill these animals so that we can get rid of the Native Americans, is what they were doing. This is Section B, conflicts over land. In 1868, the United States signed a treaty with the Lakota, granting them large areas of land. That included the Black Hills area of present-day South Dakota. This area has deep religious meaning to the Lakota. Then, in 1874, gold was discovered in the Black Hills. Immediately, thousands of miners flooded into this sacred part of the Lakota territory. Violence quickly followed. Yeah, so just one of those things. The Black Hills are, I mean, they're not hills; they're mountains. They're huge, but basically, they're not really good for farming, for the things that people were doing at this time. And so, consequently, the U.S. government was like, sure, whatever, you can have that. But then somebody discovers gold out there, and all of a sudden everybody wants to move there so they can, dig holes in the ground and then strike it rich. Um, so yeah. Now these mountains were very sacred to the Lakota people. They had a lot of like ceremonial like burial grounds and things like that. So they're not. Some of them are not very happy about the fact that like we have Mount Rushmore out there. You guys are probably aware of. There's also Crazy Horse is the other monument that's being built out of a mountain, which is even larger than Mount Rushmore. If you've ever gone and seen Mount Rushmore, it's pretty big. So the Crazy Horse one is going to be even larger. However, some of Crazy Horse's descendants and other people of the Lakota tribe hate the fact that the people are making this Crazy Horse monument because they think that he would have been appalled at destroying this mountain and changing it so that it's it has this monument to him. So just kind of an interesting thing. Anyway, all right. So Little Bighorn. The Lakota chiefs, including Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, refused to allow miners to dig in the Black Hills. So let's see. No, that's just okay. Never mind. Okay, sorry. I was going to have a picture of Crazy Horse. In fact, here is a picture of Crazy Horse. And then also here's a picture of Sitting Bull. All right. So there's those guys. Yeah, they refuse to allow miners to dig in the Black Hills because, of course, these are sacred lands. They don't want to just let people dig up their sacred land. Think of it as somebody discovering something valuable under Saint Cecilia Church. And so a whole bunch of people who do not belong to the church come in and just start digging holes in the church. Like, we'd probably not be super excited about that, right? Or they're digging up the grass in the soccer field outside of St. Cecilia School, um, like we might be a little bit unhappy with that, uh, but that's essentially what was happening. Anyway, so they refused to allow miners to dig in the Black Hills. As a result, U.S. soldiers were sent to Sitting Bull, or sent to drive Sitting Bull and the Lakota out of the area and onto reservations. On June 25th, 1876, now it says Colonel George Custer, but Custer was a general, so I'm not quite sure why it says Colonel, but it probably doesn't matter a whole lot. Custer attacked Sitting Bull's camp on the Little Bighorn River. Too late, Custer discovered that he was outnumbered 4-1. Hundreds of Lakota warriors counterattacked, killing Custer and all his troops at the Battle of Little Bighorn. It was the last major Native American victory on the Great Plains. Okay, so we're going to talk about Custer just real quick because he's kind of an interesting character, and character is the right word for him. So Custer was kind of a rock star. He wore there's a picture of him here in the book. There he is right there. So he wore this kind of big, floppy, fancy hat. You weren't allowed to have like reporters travel with your forces, with the army, but he had a reporter that was traveling with him. In fact, there was a reporter who was killed at Little Bighorn that was traveling with him because he kind of was like building up his brand, I guess is a way to put it. He was a very successful general in the Civil War. He was at Gettysburg. He was received commendations for his bravery. In fact, his men loved him. He would wear this bright red scarf and other things to like kind of make him stand out. And he was considered to be quite brave. So he's kind of this interesting character. He was also court-martialed twice. He got kicked out of the military, but then brought back in. He was the general. So when Robert E. Lee wanted to surrender, they brought out the white flag, for basically saying, "Hey, we just want to talk." And he was the general who accepted the white flag and was given the notice that Robert E. Lee would like to surrender to General Grant. So Custer was kind of this character. He also, so Ulysses S. Grant, the general who was the Union general that basically won the Civil War, he becomes president. And one of the things that happens during his presidency is there's a little bit of corruption going on. They find out that, in particular, there's I'm not going to get into it because it doesn't really matter. It's not part of this chapter. But basically, people that Ulysses S. Grant are close to are making money when they shouldn't be making money. Let's put it that way. It's pretty simple. Custer is called to testify before Congress, and he does. And he says, yeah, this thing is going on. And then he also lets people know that Ulysses S. Grant's brother, I think it was also in this thing. So you've got, the president is essentially called the commander-in-chief. He's like the leader, essentially, of the military. And then this guy who's kind of a hot shot, who wants to be famous, essentially. He's, this larger-than-life personality. Everybody knew, not everybody, but lots and lots and lots of people knew who Custer was. He would have been, he was a celebrity at the time, and he just kind of went and was like, yeah, hey, the president's brother is involved in this too, by the way. So that's oversimplifying it, of course, but I think he ruffled some feathers when he did that. But he was not lying; he was telling the truth. So anyway, yeah, that's Custer. Now, Custer goes. He's been tasked to go and fight the Lakota and drive them onto the reservation, force them to be on the reservation. One thing that has happened earlier in his life is that he learned that Native Americans will not attack you if you have their women and children as your prisoners. There was a point where he was in the midst of a fight and potentially was going to be a disaster, and he had gotten to this Native American village, and they captured the women and children, and uh, he had them lined up in front of his men and forced to march, and they marched past a whole bunch of Native American braves, so the warriors, and the warriors didn't attack them because they wouldn't risk the women and children. In Native American culture, particularly, I think Lakota culture, especially, the light on that's just weird. Um, Sorry, I'm dealing with light. In Lakota culture, in particular, uh, they looked at the women were revered. It was kind of this thing where like men were, they had to go on like spiritual journeys to get visions, but they felt like the women got them all the time. It was just kind of one of those things. And I mean, to be perfectly honest, if you lined up a whole bunch of women and all the wives and children of, or husbands for that matter, and children of our military forces and had them march out in front of you, uh, you'd find that our soldiers would also be very unwilling to attack. But Custer has discovered this. So one of the things that happens is he knows this is a very large village. Um, the book says that too late, he discovered that he was outnumbered 4-1. Um, he was this close to winning this fight. Um, Really, what it was, the Bighorn is a very large river, and there's lots of hills around it, and this huge village is down there, and he ends up splitting his forces into a couple different groups. Um, One of the groups is run by a guy who doesn't really like Custer very much, and then another group is run by a guy who's maybe not as brave as you might like in a leader. So the one with the guy Reno was his name. So I think it's Colonel Reno. Anyway, he he goes and he finds the village and he's going to attack it. Um, and then what he doesn't realize is, because he looks and he sees that, oh, like there's just women and children, so they think the men are all out hunting. The men aren't out hunting. The men are sleeping. They're all in the village. And so as his men start to attack, as they start charging forward, of course, the Native Americans realize what's happening, and all these warriors come out of these teepees, and too late, Reno realizes that he is super outnumbered. So he, he stops. They stop charging. They're on horses. This is a cavalry. They stop charging and they just start shooting, but there's just more people than they can possibly shoot with their guns at this time, like because you got to reload and things like that. They're better than Revolutionary War muskets, but it still takes a long time to shoot, reload, that sort of thing. So they run, they retreat. Okay, they make it across the river. They get up to basically onto a hill that they can defend themselves a little bit better. And they're able to get away. However, he loses like a third of his men. Custer was supposed to have been following this guy, and instead he saw some like kind of a scouting party for the Native Americans. So he sort of followed them, and was not backing up the guy and he should have. Not only should he have been there to back this guy up because he told him he was, but he should have let the guy know what he was doing, and he didn't do that. So that was kind of one of Custer's really big mistakes, is that he did not alert his men to a change in his plans. So he kind of follows these guys up, and they get down close to this village as well, or maybe it's a different village. This was a massive, massive grouping of Native Americans. Anyway, he sees, I think actually what it is he sees the Native American women and children retreating. He realizes that Reno has come into this, has gotten close to this village, attacked it, and the women and children are fleeing because, of course, they want to be protected and they don't want to die. And so Custer, having learned before that if you capture the women and children, the battle's over. So he decides to go after them, and so he leads his men down this hill to this river. Well, there's several areas of this river that you can cross, but Custer doesn't know where those areas are. And the areas that aren't great for crossing are really boggy, like the ground is super muddy and it's hard to get through. And so they come down, they get really close, but they aren't able to cross the river where they happen to be trying to get down. So they have to pull back, and then they're sort of following them, but on the opposite side of the river. Anyway, eventually the Native Americans have pushed Reno far enough away that they don't have to worry about him, and so they turn and they give chase, and Custer kind of comes across groups of them, and essentially he's outnumbered massively, and he starts to realize that he's in trouble. Um, Prior to this, he has sent notice to the guy who doesn't like him very much, and let him know, just like a quick note that we today is in a museum. They have the note, and so it's um, yeah. He gets the note and he's like, "Oh, okay," and it basically just says something to the effect of like, "We found the village. Come quick." And um, the guy's like, "Oh, Custer's out chasing Glory," and instead of he was like less than a half hour away if he had just uh, they were all on their horses. If they had just taken off at a little bit more of a pace or a higher pace, they probably could have gotten to him and perhaps turned this into a victory. Instead, he chose to just kind of like slowly work his way over there. So he kind of goes and he ends up meeting up with Reno. Reno's men are just have a large number of them have been massacred, and they are kind of patching themselves up, resting, just trying to recover from this near getting wiped out battle that they were just in. Um, so the guy arrives. Reno is essentially second in command, and the guy says, "Oh yeah, hey, hear that Custer's needs us," and Reno's like, "I don't care. I've got to find my friend." So this guy, who's the leader of this very large force of men, spends a half hour looking for his dead friend, which sounds nice, except for his commanding officer and the men who were with him are being slaughtered during this time, and he's just wandering around. He's kind of like almost lost his mind, basically. Um, so yeah, so eventually, some of Custer's men just are like, "We're going, we don't care," and they charge off to help Custer, but by that point it is way too late. So Custer and his men kind of are pushed back, pushed back. They were carrying a whole lot of ammunition on their horses, but they had to get off their horses once they started doing a lot of shooting. And Native American women and were running up and like waving blankets and stuff and scared the horses off. So Custer and his men don't have their ammunition, so they just had whatever they were carrying, and consequently they start running out of bullets as well. Um, so yeah, let's see. So it doesn't say. Let me see here real quick. Yeah. So Custer had 750 men, which would have been enough to have probably won this war or this battle, but because they were split into different groups, he did not. And I think like 200 of his guys died, and he of course is killed as well. Now, kind of another interesting story is that we know that Sitting Bull, who was this great chief, he had kind of done this spiritual vision um, ceremony thing, and um, during this ceremony, which apparently he'd done multiple times, and it had a lot of kind of predictions that had come true in the past. So when he said, "Oh my gosh, I've had this very strong vision of this thing that's gonna, this direction," and so people, usually kind of were like, "Oh, let's pay attention to this." Well, he had a vision of if we're attacked by white people, we should not take any of their stuff. Like, don't rob, don't loot the bodies. Basically, for those of you who play video games, particularly things like Skyrim or Red Dead Redemption or Fallout or whatever, you kill bad guys and then you want to take their stuff so that you can sell it or do whatever. And so, consequently, he told his people not to do that, and they do it anyway. So Custer and his the men who were with him are all dead, and the Native Americans go out and they take their guns, they take all their ammunition, any food they were carrying, just anything they can get. They take their clothes, all that stuff, and Sitting Bull did not participate in the fight. Crazy Horse did. In fact, Crazy Horse, maybe true to his name, was on his horse and charged at Custer's men, just with like nothing but a spear, basically, and or a club of some sort, and just kind of to prove his bravery, and all his warriors that were with him were like, "Whoa, that guy's awesome. He was not killed. He survived." And anyway, but yeah, so Sitting Bull does not participate in this fight, and the people go against what his vision had said. And in his vision, he kind of predicted that a great calamity would befall his people if they were looting bodies. And they looted bodies, and then this is, as we just read, this is kind of the last great victory for the Native Americans. After this, they are rounded up. Because the American people, again, this is a rock star kind of guy. Like Custer was famous, and all of a sudden he's dead. And when people find out that he was dead, that the Native Americans had, of course, all of this is probably blown out of proportion, but the Native Americans had, mutilated the corpses and had, looted the bodies and taken all this stuff and all these things. The Native American or the American people are really, really mad, and the government kind of uses this anger to justify sending out more and more soldiers, and essentially getting rid of the Native Americans, the way, at least their way of life, the way that they had been living. They are now stuck on reservations and things like that. All right, so the next section is called the March of Nez. I think it's Perce. Fighting between the army and Native Americans soon reached the northwest region. In 1877, Chief Joseph and Nez Perce began the 1,200-mile march from eastern Oregon to Canada. They were trying to avoid being forced onto reservations, so some of the Native Americans fled up into Canada. Only 40 miles from Canada, the Nez Perce encountered a force of 500 American soldiers. Cold and hungry, the Nez Perce, Nez Perce is a Native American tribe, if you didn't catch on to that. The Nez Perce held out for 5 days. Finally, Chief Joseph surrendered on October 5th, 1877. Wounded Knee. After moving to a reservation in South Dakota, the Sioux performed a ritual to express the destruction of their culture. The ritual spread and was banned by reservation officials. To stop the ritual, officials attempted to arrest their chief, Sitting Bull. In the scuffle, Sitting Bull was shot. Hundreds of Sioux fled, fearing for their lives. The army soon arrived to collect the Sioux's weapons. Shots rang out again, killing more than 200 Sioux and 25 soldiers. Despite the loss of traditional lands, Native Americans continued to fight for their rights. Although their way of life has changed since the late 1800s, Native American groups have kept their traditions alive. Traditional clothing, dances, and stories preserve the history of the Plains groups. All right, so that is the end of lesson 2. It's kind of a sad one. It's certainly a bummer for the Native Americans, but like we've talked about multiple times in history, the Native Americans, they just it's a sad story for them. There's no other way to put it. They were kind of here minding their own business, and a group came in that was more technologically advanced than them, and just over the years pushed them back to the point where now they are just on little, small reservation tribe areas, or reservation areas where they're just forced to. Well, they're not forced to stay there. Native Americans are allowed to leave the reservations. They can come and do whatever they want, but that land is reserved for their tribes. But when you consider what they once had compared to what they were left with, it's pretty sad. So anyway, good luck with Unit 2, the questions and the vocabulary, and we'll see you guys later.